Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm just going to give it probably another minute for more people to join, but then we can go ahead and get started. As folks are joining, if you could put in the chat where you're tuning in from. Great, all over the place. Great. I feel like we have critical mass, and in the interest of time, I think we should go ahead and get started. I want to note that we're recording this webinar and it's going to be posted to Efficiency Vermont's YouTube after the session. And it is also we're going to send an email following this session with resources, including the link to the recording. I want to thank everyone so much for joining us for this event, this last Weatherization Wednesday in our webinar series as part of the Button Up Vermont campaign. The Button Up Vermont campaign is Vermont's annual campaign to help Vermonters prepare for winter. My name is Becca Custer. I'm a community engagement manager with Efficiency Vermont and help to lead the Button Up campaign. And I'm joined this evening by my colleague, Nate Gunnish, who will be leading today's presentation. And then we also have another one of our colleagues, Steve Spatz, who's going to be assisting with the Q&A. Nate, I'm going to have you move to the next slide. Before I turn it over to you, I just want to run through a few background information and some logistics. So for folks who don't know who Efficiency Vermont is, we are a statewide energy efficiency utility, and we serve every part of the state except for Burlington. And really what we do is help reduce the cost of energy for all people living in Vermont and really help customers understand and make better use of their energy and reduce greenhouse gases. We are also a sponsor of the Button Up campaign. We sponsor and facilitate the campaign, but it's also supported by a wide range of partners, including utilities, weatherization agencies, town energy committees, and several other partners. Nate beat me to it, but we are also giving out a $50 gift card to one attendee from today's webinar. We're going to do that random drawing after the webinar, but just know if you're that lucky winner, you can expect an email from us in the coming days. Lastly, before I turn it over to Nate, I just want to mention that we have a pretty chock-full presentation tonight. We're not going to have too much time for Q&A at the end, probably 10 or 15 minutes, but encourage you, as questions come up, please put them in the Q&A. If you joined any of our previous Weatherization Wednesdays where we're asking people to put in the chat, today we're asking to put in the Q&A. It's going to help make the resources that some of my other colleagues are going to share in the chat a little easier to see. You won't have to be digging through the questions and answers. So again, put questions in the Q&A. If you are joining on Facebook, you can continue to put your comments or questions in the comments there. We're going to do our best to get to as many questions as possible, but we have a pretty full group with us today and not a ton of time. So we're going to try to group some of those questions more into themes and address those. So we might not be able to get to your very specific question about your home. And if that's the case, I highly encourage you to take advantage of some of the resources that Nate's going to detail at the end of his presentation, including calling Efficiency Vermont's customer support, signing up for a virtual home energy visit with one of our energy experts, or directly connecting with a contractor to kind of talk through your specific situation. So I just want to preface that. And I think that's it from me, Nate. So I'm going to turn it to you and take it away.
Great. Thanks, Becca. Okay, great. Thanks everybody for being here. This is a super exciting topic. I'm really glad we have a lot of interest in this. A lot of people are talking about heat pumps. So let's get right into it. As Becca mentioned, we have a lot of content to cover. As a quick overview, our subject line here is a heat pump system right for you? But that's maybe a little bit of a misnomer. I'm actually going to get into how to make a heat pump system right for you, right? So when does it work well for you? Which type of system is going to work for you? We'll talk about the different types that exist. A lot of us kind of only think of one thing when we think of heat pumps. So we'll talk about all the different types and some of the challenges and different things you can think about with your own home when you're thinking about is a heat pump system right for you? So get right into it. We'll talk, these are kind of just some signposts, some things we'll go through as we go along. I'll start by talking about some heating system fundamentals. That'll be really some high level review for a lot of people on the call, but I think those are just going to be good to establish where we're coming from and talk about the difference between what you may have in your current home and heat pumps and how that difference is going to impact you. We'll talk a little bit about what a heat pump is and how it works. I won't spend a ton of time on the technical side. If you have a lot of questions about that, Efficiency Vermont serves as a great resource. You're always welcome to reach out to us, but we'll breeze through that section. And then I think the bulk of our time we'll spend on the types of heat pumps that could be suitable for your home. So we'll break down the different types of heat pumps, what kind of homes they work well in. I'll put some photos up so you can see sort of, is this what I have? And what could work well for you. And then I'll end quickly with some next steps, some of our resources and some questions for contractors. So again, just things to think about as you go through. One of my big goals here is for you to be an informed consumer, right? So heat pumps are relatively new technology. The technology's been around for a long time, but in our market, as we've started installing them, and so, to make you an informed consumer, you want to know the right vocabulary, you want to know the right questions to ask. So that's a topic that we're kind of going to be addressing throughout, but I'll give a quick list of the questions right at the end, and hopefully you guys can write those down. Speaking of some questions, these are just kind of some questions that I think you should be able to answer for yourself, or at least ask yourself when you're thinking about heat pumps, right? So these are, if you're taking notes, this is the stuff to write down. These are the main questions that you're going to want to kind of have in the back of your mind when you're having a conversation with a contractor, when you're thinking about what you're going after. Just to quickly break down the relevance here, thinking about goals, right? So what are you trying to get done? Are you trying to completely get off of fossil fuels? Are you trying to just save a little money on your energy? Are you trying to add air conditioning? These are all potential goals that you may have for a heat pump system. What are your comfort needs? Do you need more cooling? Do you need to, are you the type of person who really values having a pretty warm house in every single room? We talk about what heat pump system will work best for you if that's the case. What is your house like? What is your distribution system? And how much weatherization has been done? These questions all kind of go hand in hand. We'll get into some of the details on all of those things, but for now, I'll just say that all of these things are going to impact what kind of heat pump system you're ready for right now, right? So, and then we'll talk a little bit about potential projects and how you can, be ready for a heat pump in the future. And lastly, what's your budget, right? So different heat pump systems are going to have different upfront costs associated with them. So, if you're planning a serious renovation on your house and you're financing something, you got a big project planned, you may have a different budget than if you're just trying to add a little bit of really high efficiency heating for part of the year. So that's going to be a different budget. That's going to be a different consideration. Again, these are just all things to write down, to think about, to have in the back of your mind as we go through it, because your answers to these questions are going to kind of dictate, which heat pump system is going to end up working right for you going forward. Okay, so back to those original signposts that I laid out. Let's buzz quickly through some traditional fuel-fired heating. We're going to be talking primarily about boilers and furnaces, as we see here. This is, again, really good to understand because, one, we can start to think about how these differ from heat pumps, not just technologically, but sort of practically, how they distribute heat throughout the house. That difference is going to make an impact on what makes one heat pump right for you versus another. So let's get right into it. Let's start with boilers here because boilers are super common in Vermont. A lot of us have boilers. I think at a really high level, the hallmark of a boiler is hot water distribution, right? So if you have hot water running throughout your house to keep you warm, you have a boiler. I've included some photos here, but fundamentally boilers, they have what we call hydronic distribution, right? So that's hot water being moved throughout the house. You're burning some kind of fuel that could be oil, propane, natural gas, it could be wood pellets. There's a variety of different systems here, but these units burn fuel, heat up water, distribute it around the house through pipes, radiators. They end up in the radiators, baseboards. A lot of us have those fin tube baseboards. Those are super common in our state. And sometimes heated floors, right? So radiant slabs as well are another place where that heat can come out of. And I mentioned here, my bottom bullet point is just that sometimes these also provide domestic water heating. And if that's the case for you, then you'll want a strategy if you're getting rid of your boiler for dealing with that domestic hot water. And that's something we could talk about a little bit. I think, these hot water emitters, if you're like, not really sure, do I have a boiler or do I have something else? Look at these radiators down these bottom two photos. If that's what you have, that's what you got. And then let's talk about furnaces. So furnaces are also a way to distribute heat throughout the house. These are hot air. Some people call them forced air systems, right? So that's the hallmark of a furnace, is hot air. Again, this is pretty high level. This is review for almost everybody, but I just want to make sure that everybody's on the same page with vocabulary, because if you are referencing one thing and you actually have the other, and you call a contractor, they might get frustrated or get confused. You're just not going to be on the same page. So it's helpful to just be aware of all of this stuff. So furnaces, again, this is hot air distribution. So you're burning fuel, could be the same type of fuel I just mentioned. And then an air handler or some kind of blower pushes the air that's heated by that fuel throughout the house via ductwork. Often there's a filter in line, and it'll end up in registers or grills, some kind of diffuser, something that sends the air out into the room where you are. So again, that's kind of the hallmark of a furnace, that hot air. And then the last systems I want to talk about is the systems that are non-distributed. And so we've got space heaters. Again, these will burn fuel. Often these are propane or gas. We see these a lot in rental apartments, but also in homes as well. And wood stoves, right? So wood stoves and pellet stoves, you're burning some kind of a wood-based product. The kind of hallmark here is that they're not distributed, right? So unlike the other two systems, these are what we call point source emitters. So they're one place where all of the heat comes from. That's the source of the heat for kind of as many rooms as it can reach, right? And I just highlight these because as we think about different types of heat pumps, some behave more like these point source emitters, these wood stoves, these space heaters, and some behave more like the furnaces and the boilers that we just talked about. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about these different systems. And then just some, again, to wrap up this section, we'll talk quickly about some of the hallmarks here. So I'm going to jump past the first bullet point, come back to it in a sec. These systems obviously don't provide cooling. That's kind of in the name. They are subject to volatile fuel pricing, depends a little bit on the fuel, but that's something that we've seen more and more recently. And of course, there's carbon emissions and other air pollutants related to combustion. So there's concerns about carbon monoxide and occupant health if you have these systems. So that's something to consider. Just from a practical standpoint, when we think about these systems, they have really high temperature distribution, right? So these are the furnaces and the boilers. So they're heating up by burning fuel. They're creating a really high temperature, and they're distributing that around the house. They often come on, run really high, and then turn off, and then the thermostat allows the house to kind of drift down a little bit. Boom, they come back on again, right? And you get a little bit of a fluctuation in temperature as a result. That's so important for everybody to know, but when we think about heat pumps, they work in kind of a different way. So when I reference, I'll be talking about lower temperature distribution, and that way you have a sense of kind of what I mean by the difference between the two things. That's high temperature distribution coming out of these fuel-fired systems, typically. Okay, so what about heat pumps? We'll get into this, take a sip of water. So I think this is what we're all here to learn about, right? But let's talk about what makes these different from the other systems. Let's talk about some of the hallmarks of these systems, what makes them beneficial, why people are talking about them, why they're interested in them. They are obviously super efficient, right? That goes without saying. And so let's get right into it. Some of the quick characteristics of a heat pump, just in case you're not as familiar with the technology. Again, I'm gonna kind of move quickly through how they work. We won't spend a ton of time today on, actually the mechanics behind how a heat pump functions, but just so everybody's on the same page and thinking about how these work. So these run on electricity, and they provide both heating and cooling. That's something that the name doesn't necessarily imply. But as I'll talk about shortly, they're actually sort of air conditioners that can run in reverse, right? And these units are much more efficient than electric resistance heating. And this is worth mentioning because I think a lot of us think electric heating and we think of really what we think of as inefficient or expensive heating, which is traditional electric resistance heating. And that's can be found still in a lot of places, water heaters and a variety of other environments. Some of you may have this in your home, and heat pumps work typically 2 to 4 times more efficiently. Let's talk about why that is. So essentially, and again, we won't get too much into the physics of how this works, but fundamentally, heat pumps, instead of creating heat like you do by burning fuel, they're moving heat from one space to another, right? So they rely on a couple of principles. One is that heat is always going to move to cool, right? So and then the other principle is using phase change of materials to change the temperature of something without actually having to add heat to it. By pressurizing it, we can change the temperature. So again, I'm going to move through this quickly, but a way to think about it is just to help most people understand it. Think about an AC system, right? So that's kind of what this diagram is displaying. Heat always moves to cool, right? So if you move a cool liquid through your home, the heat in your house is attracted to that cold liquid, and then you can reject that heat back to the outside. And we're able to step that temperature up and down and take advantage of differences in temperature. And this heat always goes to cool principle by using the compressor and the expansion valve. Again, we don't need to get into too much detail. You're welcome to give us a call. We can give you a breakdown. There's a lot of great resources online, but suffice it to say, these are kind of the principles that we rely on. A heat pump, somebody smart thought to run this thing in reverse, right? So now we can do the same thing where we are collecting heat outside the house and rejecting it back to inside the house. There's a lot of questions about how do we do this in Vermont in the winter? It gets really cold. But basically what I can say is that the technology has improved such that we can get those outdoor, the liquid, we can get it down to such a temperature outside, or the material, right? It changes between a gas and a liquid, but the refrigerant, we can get it so cold outside that it's still able to pull heat from the outside environment, even when it's really cold outside. And then we move that inside and we're able to bring that heat into our homes. Again, it's through this collecting of heat and redistributing it into the house that we get these really high efficiencies, as opposed to kind of the physical limits of a particular fuel source, right? You can only get so much heat out of a fuel source, whereas with this, you're collecting heat and you're moving it. And that's what allows these systems to operate so efficiently. Fundamentally, they all use the same technology. There's going to be a few different variations. You have outdoor units that are out in the air. And I know these little images are a little small, but there's fan units basically that operate outside that pull heat from the outside or reject heat to the outside. And then there's also systems that go underground. And that's going to be a bulk of what we talk about here in the latter half of the presentation. So I'll move a little quickly past that. Similarly, we'll talk in more detail about the different ways you can distribute that heat inside the home. But for now, I'll say, as you can see from these little illustrations here, there's a variety of different ways to distribute that heat in the house, through the piping, through ductwork. There's a few different ways to do it. Kind of one of the hallmarks that I'll highlight here, and we'll come back to, is we talked about how with the fossil fuel fired systems, those are high temperature distribution. These are lower temperature distribution systems, right? So I'll talk about exactly what that means kind of via some examples as we go. But that's a key difference that's gonna impact how we do distribution in the house. And then really before we get into the details of one system versus another, I wanna just really address this big question that comes up a lot of times, which is that heat pumps do work, right? Even in our really cold Vermont winters, a well-designed heat pump system can heat your home. And that can be the case even if it's well below zero. Heat pumps continue to improve, and they have improved dramatically in the last several years. Manufacturers have really started to target these markets, and that's driven them to improve their technology. They have systems that operate well below zero, and they can even keep pretty high efficiencies even as it gets colder. So the capacity and the efficiency of these pieces of equipment definitely does go down in the heating season as it gets colder and colder outside. But that's not to say they don't work, right? So this is a big question that a lot of people have. There's a lot of opinions and swirlings about on the internet, and it's just worth just highlighting that they do work. And a note to add to that is There are probably some people curious about this. So what I'll say is that in some energy efficient homes, very energy efficient homes with great thermal envelopes, that means good insulation layers, very good air sealing. It's possible to rely solely on heat pumps to heat your home. And it depends a little bit the type of heat pump that we're talking about. But again, having a really good insulation barrier allows you to have exclusively heat pumps to heat your home. Whereas homes that don't have super high levels of insulation and air sealing, they're going to require supplemental heat on the coldest days, right? So that just has to do with kind of keeping up with the load of the house. And in a lot of existing home scenarios, again, we're going to get into this in detail shortly, but it's going to be hard to get those insulation and air sealing levels all the way up in new construction environments, meeting our new energy codes. It's going to be a little bit easier to get to that place of heating entirely with heat pumps. But again, let's get right into it, because I want to talk about kind of how that can become a reality for you, if that's something you're targeting, to really try to go full fuel switch and go all heat pumps. And that raises the question, which one is right for you? Which one is right for your home, right? So these are the 4 different types we're going to talk about. I include this photo here, and you see that unit up on the wall. That's what a lot of us are really used to when we think about heat pumps. As part of that vocab that I was talking about. There's no quiz at the end, but again, this is just, it's really helpful to understand the different types. So we'll talk about what that is, and then other types of heat pumps that are out there, and why, one may be better for you. Okay, ductless heat pumps. So I think this is going to be a primary focus. So I'm going to spend a little more time talking about ductless heat pumps. And the reason that I will do that is that for a lot of people, these are going to be the go-to option, right? These units are super flexible. They work in a lot of environments. There are reasons you may choose to go for a different heat pump type. And I'll define those different types as we go. But yeah, definitely going to spend a little bit of time breaking down these units. And that's especially true because these are what a lot of us think of when we hear heat pump, right? This is what a lot of contractors are doing primarily. This is what a lot of our relatives or neighbors already have in their homes. Maybe you already have one and you're thinking about doing more, or you just want to learn about the other types of systems that are out there. But all that to say, these ductless units are very common, and they're going to work for a lot of you here on the call. So we'll spend a little time there. Thinking about this, being an informed consumer and having good conversations with contractors, it's important to know that there's a lot of different ways to refer to these pieces of equipment. So again, when someone says heat pumps, they're often referring to these, right? So ductless heat pumps are so common that a lot of times, I imagine there are some people here who this is what they think of when they think of heat pumps, right? So often when someone's referring to that, they're specifically referring to ductless units. These can be called mini splits. So when people talk about mini splits, that's also kind of a go-to name for a lot of people when they're referring to ductless heat pumps. You might even catch me in this call saying mini splits instead of ductless heat pumps, just because it rolls off the tongue and it's so common. But there are some other options. There are multi-zone heat pumps. We'll talk about a little bit about how those differ, but they all kind of operate using the same technology. So the way these work is essentially an indoor head delivers heat into the space that it's in. We talked about those point source emitters, right? Like the space heaters, the wood stoves and pellet stoves. These are operating in the same way, same principle of one unit in a room providing heat to that room, and potentially some adjacent rooms, kind of depending on the layout of the house. Because they're point source emitters, typically more than one is going to be required to heat an entire home. That obviously depends on the house layout, but I think that's a fairly safe thing to say that for the most part, for most homes, you're going to need more than one of these units. Just some photos here so you guys kind of see what we're talking about. And to give you a sense of the difference between the one-to-one units or the mini splits versus the 1 to n, some number of indoor units or multi-zone units, you can have a single outdoor unit attached to one or multiple indoor units. So on the left, you can see there's multiple outdoor units, these fan units that you can see, and each one of those is going to be connected to an indoor head that's providing heat and cooling to the space that it's in. The one on the right, you can see, if you look closely, 2 lines coming off of this thing. And these are 2 separate refrigerant lines. So you can also see it's a bigger unit. And that implies to me that there are 2 indoor heads that are both being powered off this outdoor unit. If you think about it, it's the same technology. You have that outdoor unit concentrating the heat and then bringing it into the house where it's distributed. And then in the in the heating season, when we need air conditioning, you have it operating in reverse. But it doesn't matter in terms of the technology, whether you have one or multiple heads inside. Speaking of those indoor units, I think I already showed this photo here on the left. This is the wall-mounted unit. This is what a lot of us think of. They're very common, and we get a lot of really positive feedback when people install these. They tend to be really happy with these. It's worth mentioning that there are other form factors that exist. So there's floor-mounted units. There's these ceiling cassette-style units. For your own space constraint reasons or aesthetic reasons, you may choose a different type of indoor unit. You'd want to work with a contractor, right? And that's something you're going to hear me say a lot from here on out is there's really relevant conversations you want to have with a contractor where they might say, oh yeah, definitely a wall mounted unit is going to be right for you. A lot of people like the cassette look of the cassette unit, and there are some sort of physical reasons that those can be a little challenging. Definitely doable for some people though. So that's a conversation you have to have with a contractor when you get one on the phone. And again, when you think about just the name of these are ductless units. As you can see, these are non-distributed, right? You can kind of see on each of these units here where the heat comes out of. And so these are these point source emitters. You're collecting that heat from outside, you're bringing it in and distributing it inside the house from these indoor heads. Some of our characteristics of a ductless heat pump, I'll say that they're typically the least expensive option, right? Especially a single one-to-one ductless heat pump. Those are going to be lower cost than a lot of other options, a lot of the other options that we're going to talk about as we go through. They tend to be very flexible and have a relatively fast install that's in some ways related to the cost of these units. And they're versatile in different homes, right? So they can be fit in a variety of different layouts because they're fairly small. There's a few considerations where you run the refrigerant lines, et cetera, but they tend to be very versatile and they can work in a wide variety of places. And they can be useful for partial fuel switching, right? So as I mentioned, it may be very difficult or impractical without some significant weatherization to do a full fuel switch with these units in an existing home. However, you can work with a contractor to figure out a variety of different configurations and systems that allow you to use these systems to heat 90+% of the time. And then, those few hours of the year where it's below 0 degrees, you lean back on your existing fuel fired system as supplemental heat, right? So there are options out there to use these for partial fuel switching. If you think back to that slide I showed earlier about goals, right? And comfort needs, you can think about, okay, what is it that I'm trying to do? If you're just trying to save a lot of money on fuel, but your existing fossil fuel system is still perfectly functional, this could be a good option for you to do a partial fuel switch using these ductless heat pumps. That being said, as I just mentioned, for a complete fuel switch, your home is very likely going to need to be weatherized. That's a contractor conversation you're going to have kind of see what's going on in the house. It's also worth mentioning kind of the principles of that point source emitter, that you may require some tolerance for temperature variation, right? This is why I was talking about comfort needs at the beginning. And so if you've got one of these in one room and not in the next room, you may start to get a slight difference in temperature, maybe the next room down, the little bathroom or laundry room in the corner of the house, where it's pretty far from one of these units. You're not going to get the same heat as when you're standing right in front of one of these. Just by virtue of how they work. Same kind of deal as like a wood stove. And of course, kind of a different kind of comfort need, but they're visibly prominent, right? That's something that people talk about is the aesthetics of these. It's just a consideration to keep in mind. Talking a little bit about where these work well. As I said, these are super versatile. They work well in a lot of situations. Maybe where they shine is in homes with simple layouts, open floor plans, and not a lot of bedrooms. So with less complexity and less square footage, you can generally heat the entire house for most of the season with just a few of these units. Speaking of which, they pair well with weatherization projects, right? Because if you bring your overall season-long heating load down, you can do heating with these point source emitters more effectively. So these ductless heat pumps work well in conjunction with a weatherization project. I also love the combination of ductless heat pumps and existing wood heating. You know, if you like using your cordwood stove or your pellet stove on those coldest nights of the year, you can still keep the house super toasty and pleasant, even, you know, when it gets down below zero. And I know that's what a lot of us do already, right? A lot of people already have wood stoves that they like to use when it gets really cold outside. So those two things pair really nicely. I also mentioned central heating here because in some cases you can play with the controls a little bit of what your existing system already is. And that's a good thing to work with a contractor on. You can do various set points and just make these systems work well for you. Like I said, they're super flexible, they're faster to install than a lot of other ones, highly available compared to some other heat pumps. So again, thinking about your goals, thinking about your comfort needs. They can also be useful because of that flexibility in adding heating or cooling to a particular room. So if you've got a main bedroom that you just really need to get some AC into, these are going to be really effective in providing cooling to that space, as well as the benefit of that high efficiency heating, especially when it's, you know, the right conditions outside. Okay, so as we go through, I'm going to work through a few different types of heat pumps. We're going to kind of scale up in complexity and sort of the centralized nature of these units, as we'll talk about throughout. That's going to make the cost go up a little bit, and you know, the labor that's involved in installing these units. However, you're going to get more control, more you know, direct heat from room to room as we go through these units, and I'll break down with a little summary at the end. But here we go with some ducted heat pumps, right? So as you can see, I just have a photo of the outdoor unit here, and this is a bigger outdoor unit that kind of is a similar layout to what you would have if you had a central AC system in states where they have central AC systems. Maybe you already have one, but yeah, that's the kind of unit that we're going to be talking about here. So ducted heat pumps. People may refer to these, again, thinking about that vocabulary, as central heat pumps or centrally ducted heat pumps. If you want to think about it similarly to those traditional fuel-fired systems we talked about earlier, they're a lot like a furnace, right? So there's two different types. The more common one is probably the centrally ducted kind, and these behave a lot like a furnace in that you have, you know, again, heat pump technology. So you're collecting heat from outside the house, you're bringing it in using your refrigerant, and then you are, then you have the indoor unit where there's a fan. That fan blows across the hot refrigerant coils, and that heat is then distributed throughout the house via ductwork, similar to the furnace that we talked about earlier. And that's the photo I have there on the right. And then down below, there's also the compact ducted unit. We don't see these as often because they're hidden away, right? This is a unit that doesn't have as much blowing power as a centrally ducted one. So these work well if you're just trying to put one or two short stretches of ductwork from some hidden place, a drop ceiling of some kind, into a couple of little rooms. And towards the end of this section, I'll give a kind of an example of where that works well. So it's worth mentioning that sometimes these can take advantage of existing ductwork, right? So I highlight this because a lot of people, I think, come into the question of heat pumps and say, why? I've heard about these centrally ducted ones, or I've heard about air to water ones. That's what we'll talk about next. Can I use my ductwork that I already have in my house, right? This is a big question that a lot of people have. And sometimes you can. What I would say is, we talked about how those traditional fuel-fired systems are really high heat because of the way that they burn the fuel. With heat pumps, you have lower air temperatures. They're still warm, but they're not the same super high heat air being blown around your house, right? And because of that, the ductwork sometimes isn't suitable to just be immediately swapped out. We think of this as a plug and play situation, right? So this is a really good conversation to have with a contractor. The distribution temperature, though, is kind of the key element, whether or not your existing ductwork. Sometimes because we've relied on the high heat that come out of furnaces, you know, people have installed leaky ductwork. Sometimes they use building cavities as ductwork, and that's just not really well suited for using a heat pump. So that's a conversation you have to have with the contractor. But it's worth mentioning because it can really bring the cost down of a system like this. It's also worth mentioning that these have inline air filters. So for occupant health, that can be really helpful. You can put in a air filter in line, similar to we have in a lot of our furnaces. And these can be helpful for reaching smaller rooms, right? So thinking about your goals and your comfort needs, we talked about how the ductless heat pumps, they're not that helpful for reaching smaller rooms, right? So if you know that you really want a nice high temperature in a lot of different rooms, you can pair these with the weatherization project and then get the ducts to every room, and that allows you more control over the system and a more even distribution. So the ducts allow you that flexibility. Typically, these units are bigger, and therefore they can be more expensive than ductless. As I mentioned previously, existing ducts may need to be altered or replaced, right? So if it turns out your existing ducts don't work well with the heat pump system, that's going to drive up the cost. So that's definitely a consideration. These can be larger systems. There's more labor involved, and it's also worth mentioning that these aren't suited for homes that can't have ducts. Right. I think that's fairly straightforward as a concept. But of course, you can't run ducts where you can't run ducts. So where do these systems work well? I can give a couple of specific examples. I include this house on the right here. We don't actually know what's going on in the basement, but it looks like a single-story house. And the reason that works really well is if you have an unfinished basement, and a single-story house, you can put in one of these centrally ducted systems and a network of ducts that goes into all the rooms in the house. You already have access to where that construction is going to take place, and you can provide heat into every room. I think of it as the upside down octopus, right? That's how I describe it to a lot of people, little tendrils running up into every single room. And that can work really well. So that's just one example. Maybe if that's what your house looks like, this is something for you to consider. These also pair well with more robust interior renovation, right? Because if you are planning on putting in an addition or changing a room, now you're going to be ripping out the drywall and you're going to have an opportunity to run new ductwork in case that's something you need to do. I mentioned that I would talk a little bit about an example of where a compact ducted heat pump might work well. So if you have, let's say upstairs you have 3 little bedrooms for your kids, and it's not practical to run a whole network of ducts from the basement where the air handler of a centrally ducted system would be all the way up there. And those rooms are too small for it to make sense to put their own ductless heat pump in each one. That's where a compact ducted system can work really well. You hide one out in a drop ceiling, you run a little bit of ductwork into each one. That can be a really effective strategy. I will say you got to make sure that your ductwork and your unit are within the thermal envelope of the building, right? So if you have a attic that's insulated on the flat, you don't want to go putting that air handler and that ductwork up above that insulation. You're going to lose all that heat right away, cause a lot of problems, and not take advantage of the efficiency. So make sure these units and the ductwork are all inside the insulation of the house. Getting into air to water heat pumps, kind of moving up in terms of how centralized these systems are, a little bit moving up in the complexity, but also in terms of the comfort and the control, right? So these are kind of go hand in hand. It is worth also saying that these are different from heat pump water heaters. Heat pump water heaters are a great technology that people really can take advantage of, but that's a separate conversation for another day. And I know that the names are kind of similar, so keep in mind, different from a heat pump water heater. These are air to water heat pumps. Fundamentally, this is the heat pump alternative to a boiler, right? So this is a hydronic system. You're still using that temperature or the heat energy from outside. That's why it's air to water. So you are collecting heat from outside with that unit, with the fans outside. You bring it into the house, but then you're distributing it throughout the house via hot water instead. So these are very typically going to be a whole house system, not going to be the partial system like we talked about with the ductless heat pumps. These can be really good for people who are interested in radiant flooring. That's another good application of one of these. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. So these units, again, just some photos so you kind of know what you're looking at. You can see this outdoor unit's a bit bigger, but it's still a familiar shape and layout to what we've seen so far with these air sourced units. And then inside, like I said, you're getting more comfort, you're getting more control. These are super highly efficient systems, but then there's some additional complexity. So the photo on the right, you can see the buffer tank that you'll need, a variety of different zones throughout the house to run hot water to a few different places. So that can get a little bit more complicated. but you get additional performance and distribution. So there's a trade-off there. And for some people, I'll also say for health reasons, hydronic systems work really well because then you don't have air moving around the house. So this is the option for people like that. Breaking down some of the characteristics, like I said, these are whole house systems, and it's worth adding that they have a potential for providing domestic hot water. Depends a little bit on the design. You'd want to work carefully with a skilled contractor to figure out how you could do that, but that is an option. And you can sometimes, so this is a big point. A lot of people have boilers, right? We address that right off the bat. Sometimes you can take advantage of your existing infrastructure, but that's not always the case, right? So if you have the right kind of emitters, and this is a great conversation to have with the contractor, you are already suited to running, like we talked about, lower temperature distribution, right? So the lower temperature water runs really well through radiant slabs, runs really well through something called panel radiators. If that's what you have, that works really well. But these are typically not going to be plug and play, just because most of us already have cast iron radiators, the big ones, or fin tube, and these are just not designed for 110, 120 degree water that comes out of an air to water heat pump. They're used to 180 degree water that comes out of a traditional boiler. Again, this is why we get such high efficiencies, or part of why we get such high efficiencies, but it makes it challenging to just swap it in directly. So if you already have a system that works well for an air to water heat pump, great. That's a super awesome opportunity. If not, it can still be a great system for you. I have colleagues who have done that, but replacing existing hydronic distribution can be time consuming and expensive. So that's just something to keep in mind with these units, if they're not a plug and play application that's going to drive up the cost a little bit. I'll also mention that because these are designed for hot water distribution, if you want cooling, you have to install some ductwork as well. But if you're already going for one of these systems, maybe you're already going for kind of a bigger retrofit. Speaking of which, that's a really good place for one of these systems to work well, right? So if you are already going for a bigger retrofit, changing a lot in your house, an addition, something like that, that's an opportunity to put one of these bigger central systems in, right? And again, thinking about those goals, those comfort needs, what you're trying to change in your home, all of those things kind of go hand in hand. And I mentioned here on the left, something that I've said already, if you have low temperature emitters and you have the right distribution already in place, you may be able to take advantage of that and put one of these systems in. It's not super common, but that's always worth having a conversation with a contractor. Okay, and lastly, I'm going to talk about ground source heat pumps. These units, I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A, so I won't spend a ton of time talking about these units, but a lot of people are interested in them. Fundamentally, the difference here, you can still have the same distribution systems in the house, but outside, instead of drawing your heat from the air, you're drawing it from below the ground. So a lot of people will refer to these as geothermal heat pumps. I talk about them as ground source heat pumps, but again, getting to that vocab that you might hear from a contractor, know that they're sometimes referred to as geothermal. It's also, the thing about going below the ground, right, is it's a more stable temperature, right? It kind of operates as a thermal battery, if you will. Over the course of the seasons, the air fluctuates a lot more than it does once you get just 4 or 5 feet below the ground. So by drilling down and taking our heat from down there, we're able to get really high performance efficiencies all year long, right? And that's why ground source heat pumps can be super popular, kind of the Cadillac system. They allow you, especially if your goal is a serious ambition to do a full fuel switch, these can work really well. There's a lot of infrastructure involved that can kind of drive the price up, so that's worth mentioning. There's the outdoor infrastructure. Typically, that's going to be wells that are drilled on your property, a water pump, the heat pump unit itself, and then whatever your distribution infrastructure is. The same principles of distribution apply that we've talked about so far. So you can either use forced hot air or hydronic, right? These systems can work for either one, which is great. It gives people a lot of flexibility. But again, these have to be designed for low temperatures. So the same principles we talked about with the ducted heat pump applies to a ducted system with a ground source heat pump. Same thing we talked about with the air to water heat pump applies to hydronic or hot water distribution for a ground source heat pump. And so those same rules apply where we talked about talking to a contractor, seeing if your existing system is useful or usable with a ground source heat pump. That's a really worthwhile conversation to have. A couple different types of ground source heat pumps. You have closed loop systems where you have typically a glycol water mix running through closed pipes. Again, they're just using the ground as a thermal battery, conducting heat through the edges of the pipes. You also have open loop systems, which draw directly from the water below the ground. We see a lot more closed loop systems in Vermont. They tend to be very reliable. So, you know, if you have questions about the differences, that's something that you can give Efficiency Vermont a call, and we can talk about those differences. But a lot of what we see is the closed loop systems. As I mentioned, these operate with super high efficiencies, especially when they're properly designed. More design is kind of involved here. Talk about that a little bit in a sec. But they provide consistent temps for heating and cooling all year, right? Because the ground works as that thermal battery as opposed to dealing with the fluctuations for weather. And as again, maybe I'm sounding like a broken record at this point, but if you already have the low temp distribution, it's a conversation you got to have with the contractor. It can be possible to retrofit these into existing systems. That's great if that's something that's available to you. No worries if not. This is still a system that you could consider. You just start thinking about, okay, am I making a serious retrofit to the house? Do we have plans to rip things out and redo some distribution? If so, you know, go ahead, go right after one of these because the operational efficiency is awesome. Of course, with the change in distribution and the drilling and excavation needs, that really drives up the price for these systems, right? So these are very often going to be the most expensive options. They're going to be whole house systems, right? These are big systems that are designed to do all the work for your house. But because you're bringing in a drilling crew and the specialists involved, that's going to jack up the price pretty common. And of course, because these are big whole house systems, you may need to have more detailed design. Where do these work well? Again, these are going to work in large homes. If you have a super complex layout and it's going to be hard to do a ductless system, just like with the ducted and the air to water heat pumps, these are going to work well. You want to have appropriate conditions for drilling. That's definitely something to keep in mind, something to chat with the contractor about. And that low temperature distribution, right? I'm just coming back to that again. And I've repeated that a few times. That's sort of why the ductless heat pumps are going to be so effective for so many people, because you don't have to change anything in your house. But if you have the conditions already to use your distribution system, that's a really good advantage and something worthwhile to pursue. Really quick summary. You know, if you're going to take a screenshot of something, this is a useful sort of breakdown of the information. As I talked about, these units kind of rise in complexity and cost as we went along. Ductless units, they're going to be super flexible, super versatile. Putting in a couple of those with an existing wood stove or an existing fossil fuel system to do some of that supplemental heat can be super effective and not super complex and less expensive. As we go up the line, we definitely add complexity and cost. All the way up to ground source, right? So by adding that central distribution and then eventually by adding that drilling, that keeps adding complexity and cost. Like I said, if you're going to take a screenshot or quickly jot down this chart, it's a thing that's worthwhile to keep track of. Okay, just to sum things up, what to walk away with. Returning to these questions from the beginning, right? So thinking about your comfort needs, what your goals are, and what your distribution is. I think I hit that one over the head pretty hard. We've definitely talked about how your distribution system is going to impact your house, or your options for what heat pump you go for, and budget too, right? That was something that was kind of tacitly addressed throughout. You know, just think about that as you are considering what project is going to be best for you. Different ones, you know, are going to be, or that's going to be impacted by your budget for sure. I promised that I would provide some questions to ask the contractor. Again, I'm going to try to leave 10 minutes for Q&A, so I'm going to buzz through these, but it can be a little, you know, some heat pump contractors may only install certain types of equipment. You don't want to get way down the rabbit hole with the contractor and then realize they don't do the thing that you're looking for. So it's worth asking what kind of systems they do. Do you bundle heat pumps with weatherization work? You know, not all contractors do. So if you're going to need weatherization work, you should get in working with a weatherization contractor early in the process, especially if you're going to do these things in tandem. I mentioned heating loads and sizing. This is something that a lot of you wrote in with questions about in advance. And I think what I'd quickly say is that for ductless systems, you may not need to have as much attention from your contractor on all of the heat load calculations for the house. If you're doing one of the bigger systems, an air to water heat pump or a ground source heat pump, they're probably going to want to do a more complicated heat load calculation. So have that conversation with them. How are you getting your numbers? Why are you deciding on this capacity, this efficiency of this equipment? Just worth asking them kind of to suss out the situation. And lastly, again, I've said it before, can I take advantage of my existing distribution infrastructure? If you can, that's a huge boon. It's worth doing. That's really something to keep in mind. Wrapping up here, I'll mention, just to get started, visit our website. We have virtual home energy business you can sign up for. We can do technical consultations, talk about your specific home. We have our efficiency excellence network. So when you're working with a contractor, definitely look for pros in our network. If you want to check out our rebates, we have a lot of different rebates available depending on the technology type. They kind of scale in proportion to the cost that we talked about earlier with the existing systems. So check that out on our website. That can be really beneficial. And I'll also mention that we have financing options. Check these out on our website. If you're taking on a bigger, more ambitious project, this can be really beneficial for you to go after. It's a worthwhile thing for you to take advantage of. Find more information on our website. All right, thanks everybody. I didn't save Steve a ton of time. Steve, if you want to come on and we can address some of the questions that came up in the chat. That pretty much sums up my section. And thanks everybody. I appreciate you listening to what I had to say.
All right, thanks Nate. Great information. Appreciate you putting that out there and well explained from where I stand. So hopefully all of you got some great information out of this here this evening. Been answering some questions in the chat or in the Q&A as we've been going along. A lot of those questions have been around, sizing or what a heat pump per room. Can you do multiple heat pumps from one outdoor unit? Location of the ductless unit on the wall, how that impacts the comfort. Combining ducted systems, HRVs or ventilation systems with a heat pump. So I've been addressing some of those. There's been questions on tax credits and incentives. So tax credits, there are federal tax credits available, not state tax credits available. We don't go into detail on that because the available rebates are very specific to every individual's tax situation. So something you can talk to an accountant about, but you can find information about those rebates or tax credits through the IRS. Incentives, Efficiency Vermont offers, with the partnership of the utilities around the state, partnering to utilities, electrical utilities around the state, incentives on heat pumps. Most of the incentives are managed through distributors. So a point of sale discount on the price of the heat pump when the heat pump is purchased. There's been questions about DIY. So heat pumps that are eligible for incentives are cold climate rated heat pumps that have proven performance at cold outdoor temperatures and are on a list that is maintained through an agency called NEEP, the Northeast Efficiency Partnership. And so that is the qualifying products list that the heat pumps are sold from through our distributors in the state. So when a contractor purchases the heat pump, the incentive is applied at point of sale. There is money from Efficiency Vermont that goes towards that incentive, plus the utility. There are additional add-on incentives that are available based on household income as well. All that information can be found on our website. There are different incentive amounts for the size of the heat pump and whether it's ducted or ductless. We also have incentives on air to water heat pumps and geothermal heat pumps as well. Heat pumps that we've been talking about here require, the installer is required to have a refrigerant license, a refrigerant handling license. So there's a question about what if I buy one on my own? The retailers, distributors will not sell a heat pump to someone who does not have a refrigerant handling license. That's a regulation that can't be worked around. So heat pumps are sold and installed through contractors. There are some DIY models on the market, and the Mr. Cool brand is probably the biggest one that relies on closed refrigerant lines So it is actually a qualifying unit. It's a little more complicated to get the discount on that, but you can install them on your own when using that sort of DIY product, but certainly there is a difference in the installation and long-term durability of the equipment when it's a charged system installed by a qualifying contractor. So we certainly recommend that approach. We do have on our website our EEN contractor list of qualifying or partner contractors in our network that work with us. They can also offer you the option of the home energy loan for financing the installation of heat pumps as well. So if you're looking for a contractor, that's a great resource to go to, and go to Efficiency Vermont's website and use the Find a Pro tool. Cost for installing heat pumps, there's quite a few questions on that. It goes across the board, depending on if it's a single unit or a multi-head unit. But, as a reference for one of the answers I gave for, a single paired unit, indoor to outdoor unit, one heat pump in one room, that price can be anywhere from $4,000 to $9,000. So it really depends on the manufacturer of the equipment, the size of the equipment, the installer, the conditions of your home, how far away the equipment needs to be placed from each other, site conditions. So there's a lot of variability in the cost when it comes to installation cost. Same thing when it comes to, the benefit of installing a heat pump on your fuel bill, the impact it's going to have on your overall energy costs is going to be very much dependent and variable on how you use it as well, what you're trying to accomplish with it, how much you're relying on it, what your existing fuel costs are now. So it is something that is variable as far as that answer goes. When to switch over has been a question too. When do you stop using the heat pump and rely on your existing system? If you're, putting a heat pump in to pick up some of the load of your existing system, that can vary as well too. If it's keeping you comfortable and it's having an overall net reduction in your energy costs, then you can use it as much as you want to use it. There's really not a limit or a shutoff point for the heat pump for the type of heat pumps we're talking about here. So that really does come down to personal preference and your choices on how you want to manage the system itself. There were some pre-submitted questions that came in ahead of tonight's webinar here. I think some of those things, a lot of those things I've answered here. Maintenance, there's a question about maintenance on the heat pump. There are filters, particulate filters in the indoor unit of a ductless wall heat pump. So those filters are there because you're moving air across that hot refrigerant coil to provide the heating and or cooling into the room. So those filters do need to be cleaned every so often. That depends on the conditions in the house too. But every 2 to 4 months or so, you'd be wanting to open up the lid of the unit and get in there and take out the filter and clean out the filter. So that's regular maintenance. The outdoor unit needs to be kept clear of debris. And one thing you do not want to do is if you have, ice and snow built up on the heat pump in the winter, don't go out there with a hammer and start banging on it. You'll end up crushing the aluminum fins on the heat coil and damage the unit. So, ideally, placement of the outdoor unit will minimize and mitigate that problem to a significant degree. So working with a contractor to really place the unit in the appropriate spot, outdoor and indoor, has a huge impact on your overall, maintenance and comfort with the equipment. Sizing the equipment, that's another question too. Your contractor that you work with should be taking that into account of what you're trying to do with the heat pump and doing appropriate calculations for how big of a piece, how big of a unit to put into the space. And that factors in a lot of things, with the building, the insulation values in the wall, the exposure of the room, the amount of windows in the room, whether there's another heat source there or not. So there are not more than just rules of thumb when it comes to sizing heat pumps. There's actual calculations to be done to get the right unit in to get the most bang out of it for the installation. So we are up here on time. Electrical service is one last thing too. the heat pumps don't need a huge capacity of electrical current or amperage to run. Most of them are between a 20 and 40 amp breaker, but upgrading electrical panels is a factor. So if you have a maxed out electrical panel and 100 amp service, you may find that you'll have some work to do on your electrical panel in order to fit in a heat pump as well. So I hope we've answered as many of your questions as we could here tonight, and I appreciate you all joining us. And if you have further questions, you can always reach out to Efficiency Vermont, call our customer support team. They are excellent at answering pretty much any of these questions as well. And they can put you in touch with the right resources to take you further along this journey. So thanks for having us here. Thanks Becca.
Everyone.
Thanks, Nate.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Thanks, Becca. Thanks, everybody, for joining.
Take care.
All right. Have a good night.
Bye.